I noticed my name wasn't even listed as family at my husband's funeral. I said nothing when I saw it, just stood there with my gloved hands folded in front of me, staring at the printed program as if maybe I had read it wrong, as if grief had blurred the ink. But it hadn't. It was perfectly clear. Margaret Whitmore, guest, not wife, not widow, just guest. Like I had wandered in off the street to pay my respects to a man I had shared 42 years with. A man whose last breath I held in my hands just 6 days ago. And yet somehow, in a room filled with people who knew our story, I had been reduced to a footnote. I lifted my eyes slowly and looked around the chapel. Polished wood, white lilies, soft organ music echoing off the high ceilings. Everything arranged with care, everything expensive, everything done properly, at least on the surface. But underneath it all there was something else, something colder, something calculated. I could feel it in the way people avoided my eyes, in the way conversations hushed when I passed by, in the way my daughter-in-law Ashley stood near the front greeting guests like she was hosting a charity event instead of mourning her father-in-law. She wore black, of course, elegant, tailored, every detail in place. Her blonde hair pulled back neatly, her expression composed, almost practiced, and when her eyes finally met mine, she gave me a small smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of smile you give a stranger you're trying to be polite to. Not the woman who raised your husband, not the woman who helped pay for your first home, not the woman who quietly covered expenses you never even knew about. I returned the smile just as calmly, just as politely, because I understood something in that moment that I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. This wasn't grief making people distant. This was something else entirely, something that had been building long before the funeral, something that had simply found the perfect stage to reveal itself. I walked further into the chapel, my heels soft against the carpet, and noticed the seating arrangement. The front row was already occupied. Ashley, my son Daniel, and a few of Ashley's relatives, her mother, her sister, people who had known my husband for a fraction of the time I had. And yet there they were, seated where I should have been. I paused for a moment, not because I didn't know where to sit, but because I wanted to see if anyone would notice, if anyone would correct it. Daniel glanced at me briefly, just a flicker of recognition, then looked away, as if holding my gaze might require something from him he wasn't prepared to give. That was when I understood. Fully, not a mistake, not an oversight, a decision. I moved to the second row without a word and sat down, smoothing my coat over my knees, my posture straight, my face calm. Because there is a certain kind of power in not reacting, in letting people reveal exactly who they are without interruption. The service began shortly after. The pastor spoke about love and legacy, about family, about devotion. Words that felt almost hollow as they floated through the air. I listened, but I was also watching the subtle exchanges, the quiet whispers, the way Ashley leaned toward Daniel at one point and murmured something that made him nod, the way she later approached a guest and laughed softly, her hand resting lightly on their arm, as if this were any other social gathering, not a farewell, not a loss. And then, during a lull between speakers, I heard it, just a few rows behind me, a voice I recognized as one of Ashley's friends. Low but not low enough. I guess they had to cover everything themselves. Poor thing probably couldn't contribute much. Followed by a soft chuckle, another voice agreeing. Something about how expensive funerals are these days. How hard it must be when someone doesn't have resources. I didn't turn around. I didn't react. But I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not even sadness. Something colder, something clearer, like a lens snapping into focus. They thought I was broke. They thought I had nothing. That whatever my husband had built, whatever we had built together, had somehow slipped through my fingers or never belonged to me at all. And for a brief moment, I considered correcting them, saying something simple, something factual, but then I stopped myself, because there was value in this misunderstanding. There was power in letting them believe it, in letting them continue, in giving them enough space to show exactly how far they were willing to go when they thought there was nothing to lose. I folded my hands tighter in my lap and kept my eyes forward as the service continued, my expression unchanged, my silence intact. Because if there is one thing I have learned over the years, it is that people reveal their true intentions most clearly when they believe no one is watching. And today, I was watching everything. I remained seated until the final hymn faded and the last note lingered in the air, watching as people began to stand and gather their belongings, their voices rising slowly from whispers to polite conversation, the kind of careful tone people use when they are trying to appear respectful while already shifting their focus back to their own lives. I did not rush to join them. I had no need to. Grief does not move on a schedule, and neither did I. But what I noticed instead was how easily the room seemed to reorganize itself without me. Ashley stepped forward again, positioning herself near the aisle as if she were the one receiving condolences, her hand lightly resting on Daniel's arm, guiding him, directing him, shaping even the way he responded to people, and he allowed it. He followed her lead with a quiet compliance that felt unfamiliar to me. Or perhaps I had simply refused to see it before. One by one, guests approached them, offering sympathy, praising the service, commenting on how beautifully everything had been arranged. And I heard it again, subtle but unmistakable, phrases that circled around money without ever naming it directly. "You did such a wonderful job organizing all of this. It must have been such a responsibility to handle everything. Not everyone could have pulled this off." And each time Ashley accepted the praise with a modest tilt of her head, never once correcting them, never once acknowledging that she had not carried that burden alone, or at all. I stood slowly and made my way toward the back of the chapel, allowing others to pass me, to step ahead. Because I was not interested in competing for attention, not today, not ever. But as I reached the foyer, I caught sight of a small table near the entrance, neatly arranged with envelopes, a guest book, and a discreet sign requesting donations to a charity my husband had supported. I paused there, not because of the sign itself, but because of what was missing. There was no mention of me anywhere, no acknowledgement, no role, not even as his wife, just a carefully curated narrative that seemed to have edited me out entirely. I ran my fingers lightly along the edge of the table, feeling the smooth polish beneath my gloves, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to remember how things used to be, how my husband and I had planned events together, how he would always insist that my name be included, that my presence be recognized, not out of obligation, but out of respect. That memory felt distant now, like something that belonged to another life, another version of this family. I stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, the sky overcast, the lights soft and muted, and clusters of people had already begun to gather near the waiting cars, their conversations more relaxed now, more candid, and it was there, just a few feet away, that I heard Ashley again, her voice low but confident, speaking to a couple I did not recognize. "We had to make some decisions quickly. You know how these things are. And with everything else going on, it just made sense for us to take care of it." There was a pause, then a sympathetic murmur from the other person, followed by a question I could not fully hear, and then Ashley's response, quieter but clear enough. "Well, Margaret never really handled the finances, so it was better this way." I felt the words settle into me, not like a wound, but like confirmation, a piece of a puzzle sliding into place. I did not interrupt. I did not correct her. I simply stood there for a moment longer, letting the conversation continue without me. Because there was nothing she could say that I had not already understood, nothing she could imply that would change what was true. And then I turned and walked toward my car, each step steady, deliberate, my posture unchanged, because there was no benefit in reacting now, no advantage in revealing what I knew or what I had. Not yet. I reached into my purse and retrieved my keys, the familiar weight of them grounding me. And as I opened the car door, I caught my reflection briefly in the window, composed, calm, untouched by the narrative that had been constructed around me. And I realized something in that quiet moment. They were not just underestimating me. They were depending on that underestimation, building their assumptions on it, shaping their plans around it. And that was not a weakness. That was an opportunity. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door gently, shutting out the distant voices, the polite laughter, the carefully managed grief. And for the first time since the service began, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of satisfaction, not yet, but of clarity. Because I knew exactly what they believed, and more importantly, I knew exactly how wrong they were. I did not drive home right away. Instead, I sat there with my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching through the windshield as people continued to gather in small circles, their movements unhurried now that the formalities were over. and from a distance, it almost looked like any other social event. Not a farewell, not the closing of a life that had once filled an entire house with warmth and structure and quiet certainty. I let my gaze drift across the parking lot until it settled on Daniel. He stood slightly apart from the others for a moment, his shoulders tense, his hands in his coat pockets. And for a brief second, I saw something familiar in him, something that reminded me of the boy who used to come to me when he was unsure of himself. But the moment passed quickly. Ashley stepped beside him, said something I could not hear, and whatever hesitation had been there disappeared, replaced by that same distant composure he had worn all afternoon. I looked away then, not because it hurt, but because I had already understood enough. There are moments in life when clarity arrives all at once, not as a shock, but as a quiet conclusion, and this was one of them. I started the engine but did not put the car in gear. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling through the recent messages until I found the one I was looking for. It was brief, professional, and exactly as I remembered. Mrs. Whitmore, please call me when you are ready. There are several matters we need to review regarding your husband's estate. It had been sent 2 days before the service, at a time when I had barely been able to think about anything beyond the immediate weight of loss. But now, sitting there with the echo of Ashley's words still fresh in my mind, it felt different, not urgent, not overwhelming, just necessary. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening as it rang once, twice, then connected. This is Thomas Collins. His voice steady, measured, the kind of voice that does not rush and does not waste words. Mr. Collins, this is Margaret Whitmore, I said, my tone calm, even, as if I were confirming an appointment rather than stepping into something that would likely reshape everything that had just happened. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a shift in his tone, subtle but noticeable. Mrs. Whitmore, I am glad you called. I was planning to reach out again later today. I glanced out the window. Once more, watching as Ashley laughed softly at something someone said, her posture relaxed, her confidence unshaken, and I realized that whatever she believed about me, whatever narrative she had constructed, it had already moved beyond assumption and into certainty, and that certainty was going to make what came next all the more revealing. I would like to come by your office tomorrow, I said. There are a few things I think we should go over in person. Of course, he replied without hesitation. There are several documents I would prefer to discuss with you directly. I ended the call and placed the phone back into my purse, then finally shifted the car into drive, the motion smooth, controlled. As I pulled out of the parking space and onto the road, the town looked the same as it always had, quiet streets, familiar storefronts, nothing outwardly changed, and yet everything felt different, not because something new had happened, but because something hidden had finally become visible. I drove slowly, not out of uncertainty, but because there was no reason to rush. The house would be waiting, just as it always had, filled with the same furniture, the same photographs, the same memories that no one could erase no matter how carefully they edited the present. When I pulled into the driveway, I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment longer, looking at the front door, remembering how many times I had walked through it with my husband beside me. How many ordinary days had begun and ended there without any sense that they were anything special. And yet now, those ordinary days felt like something invaluable, something that could not be replaced or replicated. I stepped out of the car and made my way inside. The house quiet, still, the absence more noticeable than it had been that morning, but not overwhelming. Not anymore. I set my purse down on the table near the entryway and removed my coat, hanging it carefully as I always did, maintaining the small routines that had shaped my life for decades, not because they would change anything, but because they reminded me of who I was. I walked into the living room and paused, my eyes resting on the bookshelf where my husband had kept his files, organized, labeled, always in order. He had believed in preparation, in making sure that things were handled properly, that nothing important was left uncertain, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to consider what that might mean now. Not in theory, not as a distant possibility, but as something real, something that would soon move from quiet understanding into clear, undeniable fact. I exhaled slowly and turned toward the hallway, my steps steady, my thoughts aligned in a way they had not been before, because whatever assumptions had been made about me, whatever conclusions had been drawn in that chapel, They had all been built on incomplete information, and tomorrow, that information would begin to change everything. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already moved. Ahead of me, quietly organizing thoughts I had not fully allowed myself to confront before. The house was still, the kind of stillness that feels heavier in the morning, when routines expect another presence that is no longer there. I walked into the kitchen and made coffee the same way I always had, measuring carefully, pouring slowly, the scent filling the room with a familiarity that almost made everything feel normal for a moment. I carried the cup to the dining table and sat down, my eyes drifting to the chair across from me, empty, untouched, and for a brief second I allowed myself to remember the small conversations that used to fill that space, the quiet exchanges that never seemed important at the time, but now felt like the foundation of everything that had been lost. I took a sip of coffee and set the cup down, steady, deliberate, because I could feel something shifting again, not grief, not confusion, something more precise, something that required attention rather than emotion. I stood up and walked down the hallway toward the study, the room my husband had always kept in order, where every document had its place, where nothing was left to chance. I opened the door and stepped inside, the air slightly cooler, the light filtering through the blinds in thin, measured lines. I moved toward his desk and rested my hand lightly on its surface, remembering how many evenings he had spent there, reviewing papers, making notes, ensuring that everything was exactly as it should be. He had never been careless, not with finances, not with decisions, not with anything that could affect the future, and that thought settled into me with a quiet certainty. Whatever had been put in place, whatever arrangements had been made, they had been intentional, not accidental. I opened the top drawer and found the familiar folders, neatly labeled, organized in a way that reflected his mind, methodical, precise. I did not search through them immediately. I did not need to. I already knew that the real answers were waiting elsewhere, with someone who had been part of those decisions from the beginning. I closed the drawer and stepped back, my movements unhurried, because there was no sense in rushing ahead without understanding the full picture. I returned to the kitchen, finished my coffee, and prepared to leave, choosing a simple outfit, nothing elaborate, nothing that would draw attention, just something appropriate for a meeting that mattered more than it appeared on the surface. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp, the sky clearer than the day before, and I felt a quiet sense of direction, not urgency, not anxiety, just a steady awareness of where I needed to be. The drive to Mr. Collins's office took about 20 minutes, the roads familiar, the traffic light, and when I arrived, I parked in front of a modest but well-kept building, the kind of place that does not rely on appearances to establish credibility. I walked inside and was greeted by a receptionist who offered a polite smile, asked my name, and then directed me to a waiting area. I sat down, folding my hands in my lap, observing the quiet professionalism of the space, the muted tones, the orderly arrangement of chairs and tables, everything designed to create a sense of calm, of control. A few minutes later, Mr. Collins appeared in the doorway, his expression composed, his posture straight. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, gesturing for me to follow him. His office was just as I expected, organized, understated, with a large desk and several neatly stacked files. He motioned for me to sit, then took his place across from me. There was no unnecessary small talk, no attempt to soften what was about to be discussed, and I appreciated that. "I wanted to give you some time after the service," he began, his voice steady. "But there are matters we should address sooner rather than later." I nodded slightly, signaling that I understood, that I was ready. He reached for a folder and opened it carefully, turning it so that I could see the documents inside. "Your husband was very thorough," he continued. "He made several decisions in the past few years regarding the structure of his estate." I did not interrupt. I did not ask questions yet. I simply listened, because this was not the moment to react. This was the moment to understand. He slid one document slightly closer to me, his finger resting near a section that had been clearly marked. "These arrangements," he said, "place a significant portion of the assets under your direct control." I felt the words register, not as a surprise, but as confirmation of something I had already begun to suspect, something that now had form, definition, and weight. I looked down at the paper, my expression unchanged, my thoughts clear. Because whatever assumptions had been made yesterday, whatever conclusions had been drawn in that chapel, they had not been based on reality. And now, for the first time, I was beginning to see exactly how far that reality extended. Mr. Collins did not rush through the documents, and neither did I. He allowed each page to settle in front of me as if it deserved to be understood fully before moving on to the next, and that pace mattered, because what he was showing me was not just numbers or accounts. It was intention, structure, protection. I traced my eyes slowly across the lines, the legal language precise but clear enough, outlining trusts, allocations, contingencies, everything carefully arranged over the past few years. And as I read, I began to see the pattern my husband had created, one that was not obvious from the outside, one that would not reveal itself to anyone who had not taken the time to look closely. He anticipated complications, Mr. Collins said quietly, not as a warning, but as a simple observation. I nodded once, because that sounded like him. He had always believed that people showed their true character when circumstances changed, not when things were easy, and he had prepared. Accordingly, I turned another page and paused, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper as a specific section came into focus. It detailed a primary account, along with several investment holdings, all placed under a structure that required my direct authorization for any access or transfer. There was no ambiguity, no shared control, no automatic distribution. Everything led back to me. I did not react outwardly. I did not look up immediately, but inside, something settled into place. With absolute clarity, they had not just underestimated me, they had completely misunderstood the situation. There is more, Mr. Collins added, reaching for another folder. This one slightly thicker, its contents arranged with the same level of precision. He opened it and turned it toward me, revealing documentation tied to properties, business interests, and additional accounts that had been deliberately separated from anything publicly visible. Your husband was very specific about privacy, he continued, particularly in matters that could be influenced by external pressure. I understood what he meant without needing further explanation. External pressure did not always come from outside the family. Sometimes it came from within. I continued reading, taking in the full scope of what had been established. The numbers themselves were significant, but it was not the amount that held my attention. It was the control, the way everything had been positioned so that decisions could not be made without my knowledge, without my consent. I closed the folder gently and placed my hands on top of it, my posture unchanged, my expression calm. Because this was not a moment for display, this was a moment for understanding. There are also provisions, Mr. Collins said, his tone steady, regarding conduct. I lifted my eyes slightly, meeting his gaze for the first time since he began explaining. He held it for a moment, then continued. Your husband included specific clauses that allow you to withhold or restrict access to certain assets if you believe they are being approached in bad faith. The words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was unmistakable. I felt no surge of emotion, no sudden reaction, only a quiet recognition of what this meant, not just legally, but personally. I thought back to the previous day, to the chapel, to the voices that assumed I had nothing, to the subtle dismissals, the quiet decisions made without me. And I understood now that those moments had not just revealed their perspective, they had triggered something else entirely, something my husband had already accounted for. He trusted your judgment, Mr. Collins added, closing the folder with a soft, deliberate motion. I nodded once more, not because I needed reassurance, but because I recognized the weight of that trust. It was not about money, not really. It was about discernment, about knowing when to act and when to remain still, when to speak and when silence held more value. I gathered the documents carefully, aligning them as I had found them, because there was no need to rush. No need to disrupt the order that had already been created. I will need some time to review everything, I said, my voice even, composed. Mr. Collins inclined his head slightly. Of course, and when you are ready, we can proceed with any actions you decide are appropriate. I stood, smoothing my coat as I prepared to leave, and as I stepped toward the door, I paused for just a moment, not out of hesitation, but to acknowledge the shift that had taken place. Nothing outward had changed yet. The world beyond that office remained exactly as it had been the day before, but now, The foundation beneath it was entirely different. I walked out into the daylight with the same steady pace, the same quiet composure, because there was no urgency in what came next, only intention. And for the first time since the funeral, I was not simply observing what others were doing. I was beginning to decide what I would do next. I did not go home immediately after leaving Mr. Collins's office. Instead, I drove without a fixed destination for a while, letting the quiet hum of the engine fill the space where thoughts were beginning to settle into something more structured, more deliberate. The roads were familiar, but I barely registered them, my mind returning again and again to the same realization, not the amount, not the accounts, but the position I had been placed in, the control that had been carefully, intentionally given to me, and how completely invisible it had been to everyone else. I turned into a small grocery store parking lot and sat there for a moment, watching people move in and out, carrying bags, talking on their phones, living ordinary lives untouched by what had just shifted in mine. And I found that contrast grounding. It reminded me that not everything needed to be dramatic to be significant. Sometimes the most important changes happened quietly, without anyone else noticing. I stepped out of the car and walked inside, not because I needed anything in particular, but because I wanted to move through something normal, something routine. I picked up a few items, coffee, bread, a small container of fruit, and waited in line like everyone else, listening to the low murmur of conversation around me. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to blend into that simplicity, just another person going about her day. No assumptions, no expectations, no one looking at me with calculated judgment. When I returned to the car, I placed the bag on the passenger seat and sat down, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel again. The same position as the day before, but everything felt different now. Not heavier, not lighter, just clearer. I drove home slowly and pulled into the driveway, noticing how unchanged everything appeared from the outside. The same front porch, the same windows, the same quiet stillness. But I knew now that what happened inside that house from this point forward would not follow the same pattern it once had. I stepped inside and set the groceries down, moving through the familiar motions of putting things away, each action steady, intentional, as if I were re-establishing a rhythm that belonged to me alone. When I finished, I walked into the living room and sat down, not turning on the television, not reaching for a book, just sitting in the quiet, allowing my thoughts to settle, without forcing them into any particular direction. And that was when I began to see it more clearly, not just what I had, but how it could be used, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would create immediate conflict, but in a way that would reveal truth over time, because there was no need to rush, no need to confront anyone directly. In fact, doing so too soon would only close doors that were still open, doors that would allow me to see exactly how far they were willing to go. I leaned back slightly and closed my eyes for a moment, replaying the conversations from the funeral, the tone in Ashley's voice, the absence in Daniel's, the assumptions that had been made so easily, so confidently, and I understood now that those assumptions were not just misunderstandings. They were the foundation of whatever plans they had already begun to form, plans that likely depended on me remaining exactly as they believed I was, unaware, uninvolved, and without influence. I opened my eyes again and reached for my phone, scrolling through recent contacts until I found Daniel's name, my thumb hovering over it for a brief moment before I set the phone back down without calling. Not yet. There was no urgency in that conversation, and more importantly, there was value in waiting, in allowing them to take the next step without interference. I stood up and walked toward the hallway, pausing again at the entrance to my husband's study, the door still open from earlier, the room unchanged. I stepped inside and looked around, not searching for anything specific this time, just observing, taking in the details that had once been background to my life, but now felt like pieces of a larger structure. I was only beginning to understand. I moved to the desk and rested my hand on it again, grounding myself in something solid, something real, and I made a quiet decision then, not spoken, not written down, but clear and steady. I would not correct them. I would not reveal anything prematurely. I would allow them to continue exactly as they were, to speak freely, to act without restraint, because every assumption they made, every step they took based on those assumptions, would bring them closer to a point where the truth would no longer be something I needed to explain, It would simply be something they could not ignore. I turned and walked out of the study, closing the door gently behind me, not as an ending, but as a pause, because whatever came next would not be rushed. It would unfold exactly as it needed to, and this time, I would be ready for it. The house stayed quiet for most of the afternoon, the kind of quiet that no longer felt empty but observant, as if it were waiting with me rather than around me, and I moved through it without urgency, letting time stretch just enough for everything to settle into place. I did not reach for the documents again. I did not call anyone. I allowed the stillness to do its work, because clarity does not always come from action. Sometimes it comes from restraint, and it was not long before that restraint began to be tested. My phone rang just after 5, the sound sharp against the silence, and I already knew who it would be before I even looked. Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering, not as a tactic, just enough to remind myself that I was not waiting for it. Mom. His voice came through, careful, measured, the same tone he had used at the funeral when speaking to guests, polite but distant. I wanted to check in, see how you were doing. I held the phone lightly against my ear, my gaze resting on the window across the room, watching the light begin to fade. I am fine, I said simply, my voice steady, not cold, not warm, just clear. There was a brief pause on the other end, as if he had expected something more, something softer. But when it did not come, he continued. Ashley and I were talking, and we think it might be a good idea to go over a few things, paperwork, accounts, just to make sure everything is handled properly. I listened without interrupting, because this was exactly what I had been waiting for, not the conversation itself, but the direction of it, the assumption behind it. There is a lot to take care of, he added, his tone shifting slightly, more confident now, as if he were stepping into a role he believed had already been assigned to him. I let a small silence settle between us before responding, not long enough to be uncomfortable, just enough to be noticed. What exactly are you referring to? I asked, my voice calm, neutral, and for a moment he hesitated, just enough for me to hear it. Well, he said, the house, the accounts, anything Dad left. It might be easier if we manage it together, at least for now. There it was, not direct, not forceful, but clear enough. The assumption that I needed guidance, that I required assistance, that whatever existed would naturally fall under their influence. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my posture relaxed, my expression unchanged even though he could not see it. I see, I said, and I let the words sit there, without adding anything more, because sometimes agreement is not about consent. It is about allowing the other person to continue, and he did. We just want to make sure everything is taken care of, he said, so you do not have to worry about it. I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it confirmed everything I needed to know. This was not concern. This was positioning, careful, polite, but deliberate. I turned my head slightly, looking toward the hallway that led to the study, the closed door now holding more meaning than it had just a day ago. That is thoughtful, I replied, my tone even. But there is no need to rush into anything. Another pause, longer this time. Are you sure? He asked, and there was something in his voice now, something beneath the surface, not quite impatience, not quite doubt, but close to both. Yes, I said simply. I have already started reviewing things. I did not elaborate. I did not explain what that meant. I left it open, just enough to shift the balance without revealing anything. And I could feel it on the other end of the line, that slight recalibration, that moment where his expectation adjusted, not completely, but enough to register. Okay, he said after a second. Just let us know if you need help. Of course, I replied, and this time I allowed the smallest hint of softness into my voice, not to reassure him, but to keep everything exactly where I wanted it, calm, unthreatened, unchanged. We ended the call shortly after. Nothing resolved, nothing decided, but everything moved one step further into the open. I placed the phone down and remained where I was, listening to the quiet return, but it felt different now, not passive, not waiting, but active in its own way, because what had just happened was not a confrontation, it was a confirmation. They were moving forward with their assumptions, exactly as I had anticipated, and that meant I did not need to push, I did not need to reveal anything. I only needed to continue, to allow them to build on what they believed, to take the steps they were already preparing to take, because with each step, The gap between what they thought and what was real would grow wider. And when that gap finally closed, it would not be because I forced it. It would be because they had walked themselves directly into it. I stood up slowly and walked toward the kitchen, the evening settling in around the house, steady, quiet, controlled, and for the first time, I could feel the shape of what was coming next, not as a sudden moment, but as something unfolding, deliberate and precise, exactly the way it needed to be. The next morning arrived without interruption, quiet and steady, as if nothing had shifted at all, but I knew better. I moved through my routine with the same calm precision, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the soft light settle into the room, and for a moment it almost felt like the rhythm of the past had returned. But underneath it there was something else now, something deliberate, something waiting. I had not contacted Daniel again, and he had not called back, but that silence was not empty. It was active, and by mid-morning it began to take shape. My phone buzzed with a message this time, not from Daniel, but from Ashley, short, polite, carefully worded. "Hi Margaret, we are planning to meet with Dad's advisor this afternoon to go over some things. It would be great if you could join us." I read it once, then again, noting not just the words but the assumption behind them, the phrasing, the quiet positioning. They were not asking what needed to be done. They were informing me of what they had already decided and inviting me to follow. I did not respond immediately. I set the phone down and finished my coffee, letting the message sit exactly where it was, because timing matters, not just what you say, but when you say it. After a few minutes, I picked up the phone again and replied, "That sounds fine. Where and what time?" Nothing more, nothing less. And within seconds the response came back. An address I recognized, the office of a financial advisor my husband had used occasionally, but not for everything, not for the parts that mattered most. And a time set firmly in the early afternoon. I arrived a few minutes early, as I always did, stepping into the building with the same composed demeanor I had carried through the past few days. The receptionist greeted me politely and directed me to a conference room. And when I entered, Daniel and Ashley were already there, seated side by side at the table, a folder open in front of them, papers neatly arranged, as if they had been preparing for some time. Ashley looked up first, offering that same practiced smile. "I am glad you could make it," she said, her tone warm but controlled. Daniel gave a small nod, his expression neutral, but there was something in his posture now, something more assured, more certain, as if this meeting was already moving in the direction he expected. I took a seat across from them, placing my hands lightly on the table, my posture straight, my expression calm. The advisor entered shortly after, greeting each of us before taking his place at the head of the table. He began by outlining general matters, speaking about assets, responsibilities, timelines, all in broad, careful terms, but it did not take long for the conversation to shift. Ashley leaned forward slightly, her voice measured. "We just want to make sure everything is organized properly, especially the accounts and any liquid assets." She glanced briefly at Daniel, then back at the advisor. "It would probably be best if everything was consolidated, just to make management easier." I watched her as she spoke, noting the confidence, the assumption, the way she framed her suggestions as practical decisions rather than requests. Daniel nodded in agreement, adding, "We can handle the logistics. That way Mom does not have to worry about the details." I felt the words settle in the room, not heavy, not confrontational, just placed there as if they belonged. I did not interrupt. I did not correct them. I allowed the advisor to respond first. He glanced at me briefly before answering. "That depends on the structure that has already been established," he said carefully. "We would need to review the existing arrangements before making any changes." Ashley smiled again, but this time there was a slight tightening around her eyes, a subtle shift that most people would not notice. "Of course," she said. "We just want to be proactive." I leaned back slightly in my chair, my gaze steady, my voice even when I finally spoke. "There is no need to make any changes at this time." The room paused, not dramatically, but enough to register. Daniel looked at me, just for a second, as if reassessing something he had not fully considered. Ashley's expression remained composed, but her fingers adjusted the papers in front of her with a little more precision than before. "We are just trying to help," Daniel said, his tone still controlled, but now carrying a hint of something else, something closer to insistence. I met his gaze calmly. "I understand. I replied. And I will let you know if I need that. I did not elaborate. I did not explain what I had already reviewed. What I already knew. I left it exactly where it was, clear but incomplete. And that incompleteness was important, because it forced them to adjust without giving them anything solid to hold on to. The advisor nodded slightly, shifting the conversation back to neutral ground. But the tone of the meeting had already changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough to be felt, because something had not gone according to expectation. Something had not aligned with the version of me they had been relying on. And as the meeting continued, I remained exactly as I had been, calm, observant, saying only what was necessary, allowing them to continue revealing more than they intended, because the more they spoke, the clearer it became. This was not just about organization. This was about control, and they believed they were already close to having it. They just did not realize how far away they actually were. The meeting ended without resolution, but it did not need one. Not yet, because what mattered had already been set in motion. I gathered my things slowly, not in a way that suggested hesitation, but with the same steady control I had carried into the room. And as I stood, I noticed the brief exchange between Ashley and Daniel. A glance, subtle but loaded with something unspoken, something that had not been there when the meeting began. They had expected agreement, or at least compliance, and instead they had been given uncertainty. I thanked the advisor politely and walked toward the door, aware that they were watching me, trying to read something in my expression, something that might explain what had just happened. But there was nothing there for them to find, not because I was hiding it, but because there was nothing to show, not yet. Outside, the air felt cooler, sharper, and I paused for a moment before heading to my car, not out of indecision, but to let the shift settle fully into place. Behind me, I could hear their voices faintly as they stepped out of the building, lower now, less certain than before. I did not turn around. I did not acknowledge them. I simply opened my car door and sat inside, closing it gently, creating a quiet space where their voices could no longer reach me. I rested my hands on the steering wheel again, the same position I had found myself in more than once over the past few days. But this time there was no question, no uncertainty, only a clear understanding of what had been revealed and what would come next. I drove home without distraction, the road unfolding in front of me in a way that felt almost symbolic, steady, predictable, but leading somewhere entirely different from where it had started. When I arrived, the house greeted me with the same quiet stillness, but now it felt less like a place of memory and more like a place of control, a place where decisions would be made without interference. I stepped inside and placed my purse on the table, then walked directly to the study, opening the door without hesitation, the room unchanged, the desk exactly as I had left it, and I moved toward it with purpose, not to search, not to question, but to confirm. I opened the drawer and retrieved the folders, setting them down carefully, aligning them with the precision my husband had always used. And for a moment I allowed myself to think of him, not in grief, not in loss, but in understanding. He had seen this coming, not in detail, not in specific words or actions, but in nature, in pattern, in the way people reveal themselves when they believe they have the advantage. I opened the folder again, my eyes moving across the same lines I had read earlier, but now they carried a different weight, because now I had seen the other side, the assumptions, the intentions, the quiet calculations that had already begun to form, and I understood exactly where they would lead. I closed the folder and placed my hand on top of it, steady, grounded, because the decision was no longer abstract. It was clear, defined, and entirely mine. I would not confront them, not directly, not yet. There was no need to argue, no need to correct, because the truth did not require defense. It required timing, and that timing was approaching. I stepped back from the desk and looked around the room one last time before turning off the light, closing the door behind me with a soft, controlled motion. As I walked back into the main part of the house, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen briefly, Daniel's name appearing once more, but this time I did not answer. Not immediately. I let it ring, not out of avoidance, but out of choice, because for the first time, the rhythm of this situation was no longer being set by them. It was being set by me, and when I finally picked up the phone, I already knew exactly what I would say. Not everything, not the full truth, Just enough. Just enough to let them continue. Just enough to bring them one step closer to the moment when everything they believed would no longer hold. And as I listened to his voice begin again on the other end of the line, I realized something with complete certainty. They had treated me as if I had nothing, as if I did not understand, as if I was already out of the equation. And I had let them believe it. I had said nothing, corrected nothing, revealed nothing, because sometimes the most powerful position is the one no one sees. And when the time came, I would not need to explain it. I would only need to let it speak for itself.